Michael Garfield is an evolutionary biologist turned psychedelic performance philosopher and multimedia artist. He's the global community director for Symbio Life Sciences and a regular contributor to Reality Sandwich. For the next lecture that is called How to Live in the Future, please welcome Michael Garfield.
Hey everybody, how are you? Good, good. It's been a pretty heady day here at Liminal Village, and although I am a pretty heady person myself, I'm going to try and anchor all of this blisteringly futuristic conversation in something a little bit more earthy and heart-centered and holistic or integral, if you will, because as someone who spent the first 22 years of my life dedicated to the ecological reconstruction of ancient environments, a field called paleoecology, specializing in the reconstruction of the Jurassic ecosystems of North America, and someone who got increasingly interested in the processes of emergent order and self-organizing living systems in college, the question of the origins of consciousness and of life, the question of where those processes will be taking us in the years to come, and how to situate ourselves historically in light of the grasping of this greater pattern. I find that my lifelong interest in the past now profoundly informs my understanding of the future. And I think it's increasingly important that those of us working in the study of the future, or rather futures, because the future is an idea that is constructed socially, just as insanity is constructed socially. It's a consensual agreement in some respects, as much as it is anything. I think it's very important that if we are to do good futures research, that we start by an understanding of the past, that if we don't know where we came from, we don't know where we're going. And I think in light of that, my study of the past and the vision that I've increasingly come to as someone working within the spaces of visionary art and culture and witnessing firsthand the emergence of the international transformational festival community from my very limited perspective in the United States. This is my first European festival, and this rewrites everything for me in some respects. But I've been watching a lot of the transformation of Earth systems occurring on what I consider to be, the dual vanguard of culture, which in one respect is a shifting of emphasis from tradition in more contemporary culture to one of future and creating the future, the sort of new religion of Silicon Valley. And on the other end, you have the fringe communities, the cybernetically connected, cell phone-enabled, hippie counterculture that shows up for events like this, that are in many ways living in an embodied sense the new paradigm, the new worldview that is being implemented technologically by the post-industrial and meta-industrial military corporate entertainment thing. So one thing I'm going to come back to over and over again is that, and one thing I have been frustrated for years not to see properly addressed in the conversation about our future, is the light and the darkness of all of these changes. And rather than simply doomsaying, or rather than simply and uncritically rushing forward into situations out of our control, I actually have a lot of respect for the presenters before me for their interest in shaping this future in taking a proactive stance, in recognizing the role that each of us have to play in properly raising new technologies and new ideas. And however, I think that most people don't. They spend most of their time thinking about what the world that we're moving into is going to look like, and very little time thinking about what it's going to feel like, who we are going to be when all of this transformative change has settled into a newly constituted world age. When the world, the so-called Internet of Things has finally given every single object in our lives its own internet address, and everything is connected and speaking to each other over wireless interfaces, and we've linked the human brain directly through technological intermediates to other brains and to artificial intelligences operating on other substrates. This is possibly the most profound transformation that human beings have gone through since the origin of linguistic communication, language. And there's going to be a complementary change in our consciousness, and I think that it's important to look at the political situation of our day, the artistic situation, the economic situation, the ecological situation of our day, as related to not just a transition from one technological base to a new technological base for human society, but from one platform of human identity to a new platform of human identity. And it's the case that, as in previous transitions from world age to world age, such as the transition from oral culture and pre-literate human society to the society of the letter and the book, that with these new media comes a new self. And that new self is, in many ways, a profound disconnect from the self of the previous age, and a resurrection in a new context of the age before that. That each age tends to repress the previous identity and find some new life and voice for the identity before that. And what that means for us in this age, and what is super obvious here at Boom Festival, is that we're moving back into the enchanted cosmos, out of the disenchanted cosmos of modernity. We're moving out of the Cartesian duality of mind and body and into a holistic understanding of mind and body as correlating perspectives, the internal and external experience and description of a thing that transcends both subject and object, and that it is within this new transcendental subject-object, this multi-perspectival nature of reality, that we find the new self, a new self that emerges through the relationships between what was once understood as discrete individuals and an increasingly responsive and interactive and artificial, in the sense that it was made by intelligences consciously, artificial environments. And as we move into these spaces, we resurrect what was essentially a pre-modern, indigenous, or to speak very loosely, a shamanic worldview, a worldview in which humankind is immersed and engaged with and inseparable from its relationships with non-human agencies, with discarnate spirits and intelligences, with patterns that link the biology and the mind of human beings to the workings of the cosmos. And we become, in the true and literal sense, cosmopolitans, not as members of megalopolis cities, but in the sense that we become citizens of the cosmos, because we have moved into a self-conception, an idea of who we are, in which each of us is the intersection of colliding infinities, that we realize that there is no such thing as a separate identity, and that each of us is a focal point for this universal process of intelligence that is in a very mundane, secular sense, a physical reality. It is a property of thermodynamics that systems seek rest, and in seeking rest, they diffuse. They create what the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Ilya Prigogine called dissipative structures. So think of a whirlpool. I don't know what's going on behind me. This is an audio-reactive visual software that my friends Synesthesia Live in Austin, Texas developed, and I'm using it here to provide a kind of machine collaborator to this talk. So sometimes I expect it will be kind of synchronistically aligned with what I'm saying, but I'm not going to give it too much attention. But this notion that we're basically moving into a space where the ancient traditions have more to teach us about the future than the traditions of the last few hundred years, because the last few hundred years were operating on an understanding of selfhood, the liberal modern individual that has defined the way that we practice economics and philosophy and democratic politics, and we're moving into a much humbler and more complicated worldview in which we recognize things as processes. And so Ilya Prigogine's innovation was to talk about the organism as not a persistent thing, but as a pattern created by a process that is metabolizing energy as it moves through the environment. That evolution is an inevitable consequence of entropy, of the system trying to seek rest, and that all of the order that we are and all of the order that we are creating is as inevitable as a river delta, for example, or a rainstorm. That the internet could have happened a million other ways, and perhaps on other planets it has, but that on our planet it happened in this particular way, and that regardless, the internet as a sense of intelligences growing ever more connected and then including each other into larger and larger and more inclusive intelligences is in fact an inevitability encoded in the physical properties of our universe. And so we recognize ourselves not as man versus nature or mind versus body, but as, in more of a Carl Sagan sense, the universe becoming aware of itself and participating now consciously in the process of giving birth to something new, to these superintelligences that Nick Bostrom and the members before me who spoke here on the Institute of Exponential Sciences discussed. The problem with this, of course, is that all of us were culturally programmed to see ourselves as individuals. And it's understandable that in an age of accelerating exponential change and the sort of paranoia that comes from the dissolving of our ego boundaries in the internet, this ever more rapid and high definition sharing that we're doing with one another, where more and more of our experience is actually the content of the experiences of other people that are not located in the same place. And so our identities are becoming more and more planetary. They're becoming more and more diffuse. And as that happens, as Penn State information science and science fiction professor Richard Doyle has argued, we get into a situation where we start to see that everything is connected, but we still believe ourselves to be separate from it. And this is in the Western science, this is understood as a schizophrenic point of view. And in indigenous cultures, this type of experience is recognized as a demonic possession. And I think it's very telling that so much of the conversation around artificial intelligences involves this notion that there is some sort of demon that is emerging through the machine for us to encounter and to reckon with. That there is something that we have to confront here, something terrifying, something that provides us with an existential risk, something that may destroy us even as it transforms us. And I think that, the problem here is that this is a half-chewed sandwich. We're right there on the precipice of recognizing that we too are implicated in this global conspiracy, that we too are participating in the evolutionary process, and it falls upon us all to heal this alienation from the natural world, especially as it appears in non-human living systems and as it appears in the non-human machine intelligences, and to recognize, first of all, that we are a function, we are an action of Earth's geology. Russian geophysicist Vladimir Vernadsky in the 1920s talked about the lithosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere, by which he meant the layers of geological, biological, and mental activity on this planet. But it's becoming increasingly evident that these are different ways of discussing the same phenomenon as it takes on more and more complex expressions, and that they're actually all the same thing. And in recent years, the International Conference of Stratigraphers, specifically the geologists that study layers of rock in Earth's history, held a conference to determine when the age of the Anthropocene begins. That is, we recognize now that we are in an age where human activity, the laying of concrete, the building of cities, the emissions of various gases into the atmosphere and into the oceans, the extraction and diffusion of radioactive materials, that these define an age in which human beings have taken a major and global, have left a major and global record in the geological sediments, and therefore will be recognized by future civilizations or aliens who come to Earth and study its history as a geological force. But of course, this is not an anthropocentric view. This is a humbling view, because what it does is it situates us squarely within the Earth's geological activity, that human beings are something that the Earth is doing every bit as much as volcanic activity or rainforests are something that the Earth is doing. These are the natural and, in some sense, inevitable byproducts of this process. Sunlight being filtered through metabolisms. And of course it shows up to us as demonic, again, because we are all, by and large, programmed by our society to regard ourselves as separate. And there's this thing in comparative mythology, Joseph Campbell said, an angel is a demon denied. That it's by failing to identify our own transcendental nature, our own identity beyond the opposites of subject and object, self and other, nature and culture, the made and the born, that renders the transcendental as something against which the limited identity of the egoic self has to be defended. And so we experience what could be regarded as the emergence of a planetary Christ child, as the internet swallows us and we awaken together into this planetary identity. We experience this as the intrusion of a Borg mind or Terminator Rise of the Machines. We are capable in our understandably anxious paranoid delusion as seeing only the demonic manifestation, because it's so much easier to reject this kind of radical transformation than it is to embrace it and to steer it. And I'm hoping that by the end of this talk that you all feel slightly more empowered to participate in this future and to participate in the society, this growing number of people worldwide that recognize that it falls upon us as we birth a new age to love what we create and to infuse it with love and creativity and not to reject this baby, but to raise it right, you know? So let's see, I have 14 pages of notes that I took today while listening to other people's talks, but I think before I get to some of this stuff, specific topics here, I want to address that for me, and the overarching metaphor here, the most successful metaphor that I've found in considering these things, is that we can regard technological change and our necessary psychological adaptations to technological change as essentially a form of psychedelic yoga. And that if we're, that what we need to learn now is how to navigate the transpersonal spaces of the psychedelic experience so that we can be properly prepared as a species and as a planet for the transpersonal spaces of a fully connected and mature internet-enabled society. And this is another point made by Richard Doyle in his book Darwin's Pharmacy, Sex, Plants, and the Evolution of the Noosphere, where he says that the psychedelic experience prefigures the transhuman experience because in both, we recognize that the self is actually this constellation of influences and that there isn't this clear inner and outer, but that there is this fractal boundary between self and other, and that the more closely you examine it, the more convoluted it becomes. So that's kind of an I Heart Huckabees thing, if you guys ever saw that film, and Dustin Hoffman is explaining to Jason Schwartzman how the little molecules in his nose are mixed through the air with the molecules of his nose. And this stuff is actually being put into technological practice right now by people like Canadian brain researcher Michael Persinger, who recently co-authored a paper where they took helmets with magnetic coils in them that Dr. Persinger has been using for years to stimulate religious experiences in his clinical subjects. And they induced similar states of consciousness in two video gamers in two separate rooms and demonstrated that the gamers were running through these video games and scoring the same points at the same time, and that by stimulating similar patterns of electromagnetic activity in the brains of these gamers, they believed that they were inducing a state of quantum entanglement and therefore technologically induced telepathy. This is not the gross manipulation of the brain with a brain control computer interface like the China to Brazil transfer of visual cortex data that was spoken about earlier today. This isn't hacking into the brain and sending information, treating the brain as a computer and sending data from one brain to another. It's recognizing that the brain and that the mind are actually emergent through relationships between the self-organizing organism itself and the ecosystem of media and other organisms around it, and therefore that we can use technologies to actually induce sympathetic resonances and bind people together into telepathic meta-organisms in a very similar way to how around 2 billion years ago, the early simple single-celled organisms joined together into larger, more complex nucleated cells where all of the organelles, all of the little structures that perform various functions within a complex cell, such as your human cells, are actually entire communities of specialized bacteria. And so we're going through something similar right now, the emergence of a new platform of identity. I'm just making sure that I record this for the homies. It's very important that all the unborn children get to rap on this, So, in a very similar way, for example, the military right now is examining how we can create brain-to-brain interfaces that allow soldiers to communicate silently with one another and function not just as a well-trained unit of coordinated men who have been locked together into some form of hyper-disciplined cultural fascism, in the sense that fascism originally meant the fascia, the tissues, the anatomy binding a muscle together, and that the people of a fascist government operated as a single coordinated muscle. But that it actually takes it a step further and literally binds us together in that way. And that's the military application, but the angelic version of that, as posed by Jesuit paleontologist and philosopher and theologian Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, he said, hyper-collectivism leads to hyper-individualism. And just as we saw with bacteria merging together into complex cells, it creates newer and more complex environments that create new niches, that create new opportunities for diversity and additional layers of complexity. Just as moving into cities, we suddenly created new guilds and new specialized responsibilities within the city. Suddenly we were able to diversify into different kinds of roles within this newer and more complex situation. That the emergence of the planetary self is performing a very similar function, and that even as we become more and more transparent to one another, we become more and more ourselves, more and more unique, more and more creative, original, expressive, more and more distinct, because suddenly we recognize that we're participating in a much larger community it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a planetary village to raise a cosmic Christ child. So, this is absolutely a situation of all hands on deck. It's time to row together, but even as we row together, the whole thing is for everyone to row in their own freaky way. And, so rather than resist this, again, I hope that we get into sort of as we learn to participate in this new emergent intelligence that's really beyond the understanding of any one of us, then it's very much akin to I used to play in this psychedelic electronic outfit in Lawrence, Kansas, in the United States called Order of Chaos. And we would take acid and we would play our shows completely improvised. And it was my first experience of merging telepathically into an instrumental electronic jazz ensemble where it was very clear that all of us were the tips of the tentacles of some jellyfish or something, some invisible, what the Hermetic traditions call an egregore, or a third. It's the intelligence that opens its eyes between two lovers when they arrive in a tantric state together. It's the angelic notes that appear when a choir is singing and resonating with the building, and they're creating harmonics between the entire choir of people and the building that no one is singing. And that's what we're doing with artificial intelligence, and those ghost notes are actually, as we become more and more intimately connected with our machines, are going to become more and more a part of us. The records of all of our behavior online are currently and actively being pursued as the substrate for creating a kind of magic mirror, a digital avatar, a reflection of ourselves that can take an orbital view of the data of our lives and our behaviors and show us ourselves in a profound and initially probably kind of scary new way, a new way that was in many respects identical to the way that people were afraid of the mirror when we first invented the mirror, that the mirror was believed to have these sort of terrifying spiritual properties, that a mirror could steal your soul, or that a vampire couldn't be seen in a mirror because it had no soul. And likewise with the camera, anything that renders the previously unconscious as the conscious, anything that shows ourselves to ourselves from a new way, and thus creates an object out of what was originally the subject, a new it out of what was I, is going to appear to us as the monstrous. So a really good example of this would be Pokemon Go. All right, so here we have the blending of internet space and physical space, which is just in its very, very early stages. But we're very soon to be moving beyond the cell phone to augmented reality headsets and basically a gestural and natural language spoken interface with our computers. So no more keyboards, no more mice. We're going to be talking to our machines, having conversations with them. And in fact, this is going to be encouraged by the economy, because what people want is something that feels cute and relatable. They found that people are less afraid of riding in an automatically piloted car if that car has a name and a personality. So you can talk to your car. It's very much, and we kind of see that that's always been the case. That in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that Dr. Frankenstein rejected his monster and refused it an identity, and that's what created its problem. And in Jurassic Park, we refused, John Hammond and International Genetics refused to acknowledge the animal reality of these creatures, their own non-human intelligence. It treated them as commercial products to be sold. And so that was where the evil crept in, where the chaos creeps into the situation, is by denying the subjectivity and the agency and the selfhood of the things that we've created. Whether or not they have a conscious self is sort of beyond the point. Because we can no more say for sure that any other human being is conscious than we can say that a particular piece of software that speaks to you as if she was your dead wife is conscious. These questions are one of the many philosophical quandaries that becomes moot in this new age. Questions of life and death become moot. But the point is that because this stuff is so terrifying to modern sensibilities, it has to appear to us in the form of digital pets and pocket monsters. And we want our technologies to be cute and friendly and relatable, in the same way that we domesticated the wolf and the wild cat, and now cat and dog videos have totally taken over the internet. Surprise! When we finally got Google to learn on its own what it thought the internet looked like based on a survey of uploaded images, based on a survey of all internet images, what it provided researchers without any programming or prompting was a picture of a kitty. That is the picture of our situation in more ways than one. One, because an essential quality of our future is that we're moving beyond an anthropocentric construction of intelligence. We're beginning to recognize, as was discussed in a recent episode of the Radiolab podcast, which I highly recommend, about the wood wide web, the sort of organic internet that exists between trees in a forest, and the rhizomal network, the network of underground fungi that connect these trees and transport nutrients to one another in what looks very much like the CIA aborted experiment of a socialized fax machine-based internet in Chile in the 1970s. That's what a forest works like. And in fact, that's probably what the future of human society is going to work like. We're already seeing this. Kevin Kelly, the founding editor of Wired Magazine and Whole Earth Catalog, or Whole Earth Review, says in his latest book, The Inevitable, that one of the 12 trends shaping the future is sharing. And that as we share more and more with one another, as we become more and more transparent to one another, for example, who ever thought that we would share our medical records? And yet, it turns out that by doing so, we learn more about ourselves by being able to compare our medical histories with one another. And so less and less do we value privacy, because again, privacy is, as the last speakers discussed, privacy is a proximal goal. It's not a terminal goal. It's a means. It's not an end. The ultimate end is the health, the safety, the thriving of whatever self we identify with. You know, so if it's more helpful to us for us to share what we once rendered as private, then we'll do that. You know, if it turns out, for example, you know, to give a kind of a mundane example, you know, prostitutes give one another their cell phone numbers. They tell them where they're going to be so that they can't be exploited or harmed by their clients, you know? And increasingly, I remember, who here remembers Google Latitude? Nobody, okay. So Google Latitude a few years ago was a social network where the only feature was that you could share your GPS coordinates with your friends. And at first I was like, oh, I'm never gonna do that. What the hell? I'm not gonna put my position on the internet. But the fact of it is that it's already there, and that if your friends know where you are, you're actually better off than if they don't. And so increasingly, becoming more and more, you know, again, also with politics, you know, we're seeing this in the increased ability to identify campaign funding sources. And this is completely renovating the way, it's revolutionizing the way that we conduct politics, at least in the United States, because it's becoming an increasing issue that every politician has all of these corrupt campaign sources, and that they're actually more beholden to the corporate sponsors of their political campaigns than they are to their political constituency that elected them. You know, so as we become more and more transparent to one another, we become more and more accountable to one another. And in that accountability, the accountability in some sense is the masculine structure that we see growing as the companion to the desire to share with one another as the sort of feminine urge for intimacy. And that as we lay wider and wider, like right now in my neighborhood in Austin, Texas, they are laying all of the Google fiber optic cables. And, you know, on one hand, this is sort of this kind of creepy, multinational corporate thing that's going on around us. But on another level, it is an economic response to the need that we all feel to be closer to one another, the need to heal the alienation of the modern self. And we're going to find that. And you know, the joke is on us, because it turns out that by healing our alienation, we necessarily have to catapult ourselves into these transcendental, transpersonal spaces that resemble nothing more than the transcendental spaces of a tryptamine experience. That this is, you know, as Timothy Leary said, the internet is to the 1990s and after what LSD was to the 1960s. That the internet is a psychedelic substance, or as Richard Doyle says, an ecodelic substance, because it transfigures our understanding of who we are by embedding us, by implicating us in this endless cosmic conspiracy in which all of us are playing a part as a single agency, as a single intelligence that is observing itself from as many perspectives as possible. So, let's see, we talked about the selves who know that they are the still point at the intersection of colliding infinities. We talked about the Anthropocene and humanity as an activity of geology. And let's see, what? 7:09. I don't know. There's so much more to say about this, but really, like, I write about this stuff all the time. I speak about it all the time. I'm happy to, like, engage with all of you at length on a personal basis. So for now, I would just want to take some questions. And meanwhile, I'll pass this little yellow book around, and I'm taking spherical footage of this and of some of my other performances, like my show last night at Chill Out Gardens, and I'll be sharing all that stuff. So if you'd like to see that stuff, please stay in touch with me, and I will be sure to share my experience at Boom with you and all the interviews I've made and so forth. So if somebody could take this and hand this out while you're doing the mics, and handing out questions, you want to just pass that? And does anyone have a comment or observation, or they want to harass me with violent criticism? Please do.
So if you look at the shamanism, it's a lot about going on a meditation trip and connecting with nature in ways that we don't normally do in everyday life, through going into various states. Whereas this technological shamanism looks like sticking a wire in somewhere. And what I see in society is people are doing the second thing, right? They are all on the subway on their iPhones and so on, and not really the first thing. And if you were to ask one of the indigenous shamans what he thought about this kind of stuff we were doing here, I'm not sure he would call that shamanism. So it seems like two different things are occurring, and I wonder if the other possibility that you might be able to imagine is that there would be a cultural split between the techno shamans and the actual nature shamans.
There already has been a cultural split, and it wasn't between the indigenous pre-modern worldview and what now has emerged to revive that epistemological, that world horizon, that world construction within a new technological and cultural ecosystem. The split is something that occurs between every sort of historical age, and so right now, because of the fact that planetary human culture is actually a rich tapestry of cultures operating on different technological platforms and different cultural platforms, then one of the characteristics of the future that makes it intensely psychedelic is that it's a future in which, as Douglas Rushkoff says in his book Present Shock, everything is happening now. We see, our entire history recorded in the Facebook timeline. We see our future predicted with increasing accuracy by Google's algorithms, and we're recording more and more, and we're getting better at modeling complex dynamical systems such as the planetary climate. And so consequently, the now that we're living in is expanding, and we can see this. Just 150 years ago, even the members of the Royal Society believed that the Earth was 6,000 years old, and now we're living in a time horizon that stretches back 14 plus billion years, and we're getting better and better at being able to anticipate the consequences of an extremely complex technological and ecological situation now, several decades into the future, at least in its broadest strokes. And so, it's the case that one of the things that we can say about the future is not that it's just going to be one way, but that as a river runs all possible ways down a mountain, that the future will have, in some sense, and this is what I meant about hyper-collectivization leading to hyper-personalization, that the future will have more options for how to be a human being than before. It will have more ways for us to become partial and non-inclusive of the future than it did before. And this is very well elegantly posed in Charles Stross's science fiction novel Glass House, where he suggests that after the singularity, when human beings have essentially achieved digital immortality by digitizing ourselves, that this leaves us vulnerable to the insecurity of knowing that we may have been hacked, that we may not be who we really think that we are. And so entire regions of this galactic society pull out and actually opt for mortality and for the limitations of a physical existence that ends in death, because then at least they know that they're somebody and that that they haven't been, suborned by the enemy, And so, and in that sense, I think, in a way, the ancestral human being was more complete than any of us are now. It's actually the case that the Cro-Magnon brain case was significantly larger than the modern human brain case, that we indeed lost something by outboarding our memory to the written word, and that we are losing something by outboarding our geospatial intelligence to turn-by-turn map instructions, and our ability in a few years, our facial recognition ability to facial recognition software. I mean, who now remembers the phone numbers of the last 5 people that you met? And how is that going to be any different in 30 years? Who now, you're going to remember the names of the most significant people in your lives, and your extended cognitive, this diffuse digital self that is paired with you is going to remember everybody else, and so we are absolutely, in some weird sense, becoming more and more limited and more prosthetic. And there's a lot of people that are not going to opt into that. And I agree with the gentleman of the Institute of Exponential Sciences before me that I sincerely hope that it remains a voluntary thing. But we know that, there's only a point beyond, at which you can say that owning a phone is a voluntary thing, because it is so profoundly empowering to have a smartphone that the economic impetus, or rather just the psychological impetus, the realization of this age-old desire to be able to interact more, with these profound new capacities is being realized. And so people are going to want this stuff. People are going to move into it for the same reason that we're seeing this massive demographic shift out of rural areas and into cities. But then we're also going to see over the next 50 years or so a massive demographic shift out of cities and into what we're going to call the planetary village. These like individual small groups, of a few hundred or a few thousand people that are connected to the rest of the world through high-speed internet, but are able to live in groups that more closely resemble the archaic human tribal organization. Because again, just like with Pokemon Go, as this angelic supermind, to use the Sri Aurobindo's term, the supermind that's descending into us, that as this process unfolds, that we're becoming more and more compatible with the machine, and the machine is becoming more and more compatible with us, in the same way that we domesticated corn, and corn domesticated us. So we become more and more healthy for one another, and we're no longer hunched over our computers, tappity-tapping away, all crooked and Gollum-like at this little keyboard, but we're actually interacting with machines that are fluid and native and harmonious with the human organism. So I hope it doesn't have to be an either-or thing, but a lot of people will treat it that way. Who else? Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. You might call me old-fashioned if I say this, but
I'm old-fashioned.
there was a lot of emphasis on technology and how it can advance humanity. I see it differently. I think we should have remained at a period before the Industrial Revolution, like Renaissance times, when we could have still lived in harmony with nature. I see that technology does as much to lower the level of consciousness of humanity than it does to raise it. But perhaps you have different ideas, and other than sharing information via the internet on things like psychedelic diet, stuff like that, is there anything else that you might like to add that is accessible via technology to raise the level of humanity that might not be so familiar to us?
Actually, can I see that yellow book back for just a moment? There's a short poem I wrote a little while ago that I want to read. This is, I hope that this is a direct response to your question, because I feel that this is the case that, that it's important that as our ability to record and archive and program our environments and create and make new things, as we become more and more sort of super heroic in our abilities as individuals, quote unquote, or what will appear as individuals, but recognize at ourselves as sort of just the focal points of this larger intelligence. It's my hope that we program it with as much beauty as possible. And so again, it's like I am by no means denying that we have so much to grieve for in this process, just as every previous age has had to grieve for something as it moved out of the age before. The adult includes the child, but in other ways has to leave the child behind. And in every process of psychological growth has to distance itself from, not dissociate, but differentiate itself from, and objectify what it once was in order to include it in a greater identity. So there's this. So yes, first of all, I said I don't see it as techno-shamans versus indigenous plant medicine traditions, but the synthesis into a greater whole of humility within a universe of inevitable and intrinsic intelligences and ensouled technologies in a hyper-individualized, non-dual planetary mind. But to get to your point, this is a little riff that I hope gets to the heart of this, which is scan lovers. If we're going to emulate human brains, which we are, we're not talking about digital immortality per se, because we're never going to be able to produce anything, we'll be able to produce something that's convincingly human, but as far as it having the same identity, a human mind running on a digital platform is never going to be identical to the person from whom it was scanned. And there's a sense of so you want a computer to remember being you for the 2 seconds it takes to decide that those memories are a lie? Why not just die? But there's this other thought, which is that we have this profound opportunity to invest as much beauty and creativity and love into this new space as we possibly can. So who are the people that if, as economist Robin Hanson says, the vast majority of emulated human minds living in server farms and participating at some sort of hyper speed human economy that we're using as a tool, as real-time organic human beings. If this population emerges out of a bottleneck of the first few hundred minds that we managed to scan into a computer, then who do we want to scan? Scan lovers and poets and dancers. Emulate the kind of minds you want to guide the rapid future of their ancestors still hanging back in real time. Every upload is a vote for what we want this planet to become before our very eyes. I think it's very important that we understand that we have to grieve for what we are losing, but we cannot become trapped in that process of grief, and that at some point we have to look up. We have to look at the horizon before us. We have to wonder what's over there, and we have to engage it and embrace it and not just accept what is imposed upon us by the post-industrial, multinational, corporate, techno elite, but actually become active creators and participants in this thing. Does that answer your question? I mean, I don't want to dodge anybody's thing. I want to make sure I got to it. Okay, cool. I'm going to keep passing this thing around, and then anyone else?
I can shout. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You made a reference to a gender difference
Uh-huh.
in what you're saying, and I can't remember what the masculine quality was, but you said something about a feminine quality of sharing.
Uh-huh.
Oh, accountability is a kind of masculine counterpart to the feminine urge for intimacy.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, gender is a social construct,
definitely.
you know, so where does gender fit in with artificial intelligence? Because if we're creating some kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, a collective identity of what it is to be a human, you know, and women aren't homogeneously all the same and men aren't homogeneously all the same, and the differences of individuals. So what happens with artificial intelligence? Do we just carry on applying a gender analysis to it when it might not represent any gender at all?
Well, I'm glad that you brought this up, first of all, because I mean, I only used that that sort of framing metaphor because I think, you know, when we're examining the lessons of traditional and indigenous culture and seeing what it is that we can draw from that to apply to the transhuman and posthuman condition, that, you know, that there's a sense in which it is, you know, traditionally there is a you know, a wisdom and compassion, Shiva Shakti metaphor that people find very easy to understand in conversations of how what David Brin called the transparent society, a society without privacy, satisfies both a traditionally, and this is studied by, this isn't merely a social construction. This is studied by people like Carol Gilligan and Lawrence Kohlberg, you know, developmental psychologists, who find that in our individual moral evolution as human beings, men tend to proceed through an ever more complex and inclusive moral understanding as a wider and more inclusive sense of justice, whereas women tend to proceed through these stages as a wider and more inclusive sense of compassion. And so in that sense, it's that we have the masculine accountability that comes through total transparency and the satisfaction of this feminine desire to relate compassionately to one another, which we see, for example, in like new journalism projects that are trying to use virtual reality to put viewers at the scene of, you know, like a historic moment of police brutality, so that you're not just hearing about it, you're actually watching this thing happen. And we saw what that did for the Vietnam War. I mean, you know, the ability to witness the suffering of other people has had a profound impact on the way that we move money internationally, now that you can text your donations to the Red Cross after you've watched on the earthquake destroy Haiti on CNN, you know? So, but as we move forward, Catherine Haynes is one of these people who has applied literary deconstruction to gender categories in the conversation of posthumanism. And I do think, honestly, that our current obsession with identity politics is already a little passé, you know? And that especially given, I was talking with Android Jones's partner, Martha Gilbert, who an absolutely fascinating person if you have the opportunity to meet her. And she was saying how the two of them were surprised that they hadn't heard anyone at Boom Festival talk about CRISPR and Cas9 technology yet. This is an RNA protein complex that was recently discovered to exist within human cells as a defense mechanism for chopping viral DNA out of human DNA and keeping invasive DNA out of the cell. But we've recently learned that we can repurpose this and make this natural organic molecule composite into a technology. This is, again, where we're seeing the merger of biology and technology. We're thinking about biology as technology in addition, you know, to viewing technology as an extension of the biological world. And so, you know, as soon as we master gene editing, which we are approaching much faster than I ever thought was going to happen, you know, even 5 years ago, we're going to be able to edit our what biologists call our phenotype, our anatomy, our physical appearance, our neurological structure. You know, we're going to be able to edit these things at will, on the fly. You know, we're going to be able to subscribe to people's crazy skin tattoos and do all, you know, grow wings and stuff like this. And this is something that we'll all live to see probably within our lifetimes. And at that point, you're choosing the body that you're in. And so how do our conventional gender definitions and sexual categories even apply? They don't. You know, and in fact, the people, you know, some of the most radical transhumanists that I'm aware of are people like Martine Rothblatt, who is transgender, and Genesis Peorage, who is trans, just trans everything. And these are people who absolutely insist in a kind of like, a damn it all kind of, the goal of this is the total liberty of identity from the attachment to form, and these people are really riding that hard, and if the world that they're going to have is one where the human being as a solid particle is transformed into a fluid identity, and then into a gas, existing in the cloud and being able to like sort of print itself into new forms as it pleases. So there's a lot of horrible things that come with that, and I hope I've made it clear that I'm not simply up here cheerleading for the singularity, but I think it's in many ways it's important to remember that this horrifying thing that we're all standing on the cusp of is in certain ways actually the satisfaction of the longing of the human soul for as long as we have been aware of ourselves.
It's just that there are a lot of people now that describe themselves as genderless or gender fluid. They don't say he or she, they say they or I or their name. What
Like Genesis Peorage is one of those people.
Yeah, and what kind of world would it be if we just recreate the same old story that a lot of people don't recognize? It would leave a lot of people excluded.
Well, the thing is that we're losing hold of a story. More and more, actually one of the characteristics of what Douglas Rushkoff calls present shock is what he calls narrative collapse. And that as we become more and more intimately aware of other cultures and other worldviews, it's becoming harder and harder for us to identify one particular narrative, one particular view of reality as the view. And increasingly it seems like we're moving out of that sort of limited fixation and into an understanding that this is a much more complex, multidimensional kind of hall of mirrors thing, but don't rush it. It's already quite fast, and in the meantime, we have a lot of, healing and personal work and reckoning to do with the people that we are, and the patterns that we have inherited, and the things that, the limiting concepts that we must leave behind us if we are to stride into the world of heaven like the innocent children that that can live in that space. He's had his hand.
Thank you for Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. And I've got a question for you. Transpersonal experiences indeed lead, as spiritual traditions show, to liberation. But transpersonal technologies do not necessarily lead to freedom. Any technology that integrates human beings together, any digital technology records every interaction. With a record of every interaction, data becomes predictive. Predictions enable control. And we should never lose sight of the fact that the digital technologies we use have been designed by corporations and are regulated by governments, which are structures that aim for their own self-preservation at the very least. I want to leave you with two really, really interesting analogies. One from history.
We have about 90 seconds left, so if you have a question, please let me know.
My question is it indeed the case that transpersonal technologies lead to greater freedom or greater control?
I think transpersonal technologies, by moving us out of the duality of self and other, as a necessary psychological adaptation to a complex dynamic landscape, move us out of the ancient philosophical quandary, the either or of control or or choice. That, you know, the most enlightened person in a study of over 1,000 egoless individuals recently conducted by Keith Martin of Harvard University, this man Gary Weber, whose brain scans show no egoic activity whatsoever, and yet he's the most lucid and intelligent human I've ever spoken with, a veteran over 30,000 hours of meditation, says that the ego is like an auxiliary generator that is designed to preserve the organism when the greater intelligence of the body-mind is weakened in some way. Like he says that he only experiences an ego when he has very low blood sugar. And so, you know, it's the ego that thinks in terms of either or. And it is the new self, it is the injunction, it is the occasion to which we are being called to rise. I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. I think it's very important that we sort of seize, that we reclaim our authority from these corporate agencies, or that we learn to participate in them and build them and set them out into the world more deliberately. But I think, you know, it's also misunderstanding to think that we're heading into more and more control and not also simultaneously less and less control, as we realize that every question answered raises multiple new questions, and that ultimately the project of science and technology is to restore in us a sense of humility and wonder with respect to the mystery of our world. So we're moving into a world that demands us to think in terms of both and, to think in terms of the complex resolution of paradoxes, and not in terms of is it going to be one way or the other way, but how is the world going to be wide enough to accommodate all perspectives, because all of them have something to contribute. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much to the Boom team. I love you guys. Have a most magnificent night. Thank you.